This is the story of how a small Gulf nation, cut off almost overnight from nearly all of its food imports, airlifted thousands of dairy cows into the middle of the desert on cargo planes, and built one of the most self-sufficient milk industries on the planet in less than 2 years. Picture a cargo jet's nose door swinging open on the tarmac in Doha, and out walks a Holstein cow bred for the cool, wet pastures of northern Europe, stepping straight into desert air pushing past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In June 2017, Qatar wasn't at war with anyone. It was simply, suddenly, alone. Its only land border was sealed by its own neighbors, its ports and airspace closed off by the same countries that used to supply most of its milk. Supermarket shelves emptied within days because a country that could afford almost anything had simply never needed to grow its own dairy industry before. What happened next split opinion instantly. A handful of executives decided the fix wasn't rationing, and it wasn't waiting for the politics to resolve. It was cows, thousands of them, flown in from 3 different continents, dropped into a landscape that had never in its history supported a dairy herd. People inside the industry called it absurd. The desert had other plans. Qatar is barely the size of the U.S. state of Connecticut, sitting on a peninsula that juts into the Persian Gulf with almost no fresh water and almost no arable land. A country that, for decades, imported the overwhelming majority of what it ate. Milk was no exception. Before 2017, most of Qatar's fresh dairy came in by truck across its single land crossing with Saudi Arabia, restocked constantly, with barely more than a few days of buffer sitting on any shelf at any time. Today, a single company, Baladna, runs a 240-hectare dairy operation just north of Doha, home to more than 25,000 Holstein cows spread across 40 climate-controlled barns. That herd alone now supplies somewhere between 85 and 95% of the fresh milk consumed in the entire country. And by some more recent accounting, Qatar's overall dairy self-sufficiency sits close to 99%. In 2024, that single company posted revenue of roughly 1.145 billion Qatari riyals, with net income of about 185 million riyals. That herd, alongside the rest of the country's dairy supply chain, now feeds a population of roughly 2.7 million residents, nearly all of whom, before 2017, had never had reason to think about where their milk actually came from. Zoom out, and the number that matters even more is the one nobody would have guessed at in 2017. Within about 2 years, Qatar went from importing nearly all of its milk to producing all of it domestically. A blockade meant to isolate and pressure a small Gulf state instead triggered one of the fastest dairy build-outs anywhere on Earth, inside a country with essentially no natural conditions for raising a European dairy breed at all. Qatar's vulnerability had been baked into its geography for decades. The country sits on a small peninsula with virtually no permanent rivers, negligible rainfall, and almost no farmland capable of feeding a modern population without heavy imports. For years, that trade had worked fine. Food flowed in steadily across the land border with Saudi Arabia and through regional shipping routes, and nobody in Doha had much reason to build an expensive domestic dairy herd from scratch, when trucking milk across the border was simpler and cheaper. Then, in June 2017, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt severed diplomatic relations with Qatar and imposed a blockade, accusing it of destabilizing the region, a charge Qatar denied. Saudi Arabia shut the only land border Qatar had. Regional airspace and shipping routes closed to Qatari traffic almost immediately. For a country used to importing the bulk of its groceries across that single crossing, the effect was instantaneous. Supermarket shelves emptied within the blockade's first days, and dairy, perishable, imported daily, with almost no buffer stock, was one of the first categories to visibly run short. The obvious fix, building a domestic herd of dairy cows large enough to feed an entire country, looked almost absurd on paper. Holstein cows are bred for temperate climates, not deserts that regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Qatar had no dairy infrastructure at any meaningful scale, no local feed supply chain built for a large herd, and a water table already stretched thin by a population that depended on desalination for most of its fresh water. Importing thousands of live animals into that environment, fast enough to matter, wasn't a plan anyone had rehearsed. It was an emergency response being invented in real time. Even the rescue flights had to route around the same blockade they were built to defeat. With Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini, and Egyptian airspace all closed to Qatari aircraft, Qatar Airways cargo planes carrying cows had to divert around the closed corridors entirely, flying instead through Iranian, Turkish, and Omani airspace to reach Doha, a longer, more expensive route forced onto the exact mission meant to route around the crisis in the first place. Baladna itself wasn't a blockade-era invention. The company had been founded back in March 2014 under Qatari entrepreneur Mutaz Al-Khayyat, chairman of the construction and industrial conglomerate Power International Holding. But for its first 3 years, Baladna was a modest operation, nowhere near the scale a national dairy supply would require. The blockade changed the math overnight, turning a mid-sized agricultural investment into an emergency national infrastructure project. The first shipment moved fast. On July 12, 2017, barely a month after the blockade began, a Qatar Airways cargo plane touched down in Doha, carrying 165 Holstein dairy cows flown in from Budapest, Hungary. It was the opening move in what became a sustained airlift. Additional plane loads followed every few days, sourcing cows from Germany, Australia, and the United States, with the initial push aiming to bring in roughly 4,000 animals within about a month. The first batch alone was intended to cover something like 30% of the country's dairy demand, a stopgap, not yet the full fix. It kept growing from there. By December 2017, the farm's first construction phase was complete. Throughout 2018, another 8,000 cows arrived on top of the original airlift, and by May of that year, Baladna had built out housing capacity for 24,000 animals and declared full, fresh milk self-sufficiency. By March 2020, the company's own IPO filings put the herd at 20,846 cows, with roughly half of those actively being milked at any given time. Animals that, a few years earlier, had never set foot anywhere near a Gulf desert. Each new plane load had to solve the same problem as the one before it: how to keep a cow built for a cool, wet climate, alive and productive in one of the hottest places on the planet, at a scale large enough to matter for an entire nation's grocery shelves. Baladna's earliest incarnation looked nothing like a dairy megafarm. The operation started in 2014, raising goats and sheep, a modest livestock business with no obvious path to becoming a national milk supplier. The blockade redefined what that business was for. The man who put the airlift together was blunt about why. Mutaz Al-Khayyat, the construction magnate behind Power International Holding, told Bloomberg at the time, "This is the time to work for Qatar," framing the entire operation less as a business opportunity than as a national obligation that happened to fall on his desk. Qatar Airways' own cargo chief, Ulrich Ogerman, put a number on the ambition directly. The airline aimed to cover 30 to 35% of the country's imported milk demand within 2 months of the first flight. Getting the full 4,000 cow herd airborne took, by Al-Khayyat's own account, as many as 60 separate cargo flights, and switching from the originally planned sea shipment to air freight multiplied the transport bill roughly 5-fold to around $8 million, just to move the animals. On the ground, the scale of what had just landed was still being counted cow by cow. A Baladna livestock manager, John Dorr, described the herd within weeks of arrival in granular terms. 35 cows already in milk, another 130 due to calve within 2 to 3 weeks. A company tracking its entire national milk strategy, one pregnant Holstein at a time. Even at full scale, the herd was never a fully closed loop. Alfalfa for feed arrives compressed into square bales, loaded into shipping containers, and sent by boat to Qatari ports, while corn, soybeans, and other feed grains are imported from the United States and Latin America. Solving the milk problem meant trading one import dependency, finished dairy products, for another, narrower one: the raw feed a herd this size needs every single day. It's a real, ongoing operational cost, not a one-time problem the airlift solved for good. None of this looked sustainable to outside observers watching it unfold. Environmental and agricultural analysts pointed out, correctly, that the desert is not a natural habitat for a European dairy breed under any circumstance. Holstein cows kept in Qatar have to live indoors almost permanently, in barns cooled to roughly 15 degrees Celsius below the outside air, misted and soaked with water around the clock to keep their body temperature survivable. Each cow drinks and is sprayed with roughly 185 gallons of water a day for cooling alone, nearly double what an average Qatari household uses daily, in a nation that depends on energy-intensive desalination for most of its fresh water to begin with. The criticism wasn't wrong, and it hasn't fully gone away. A dairy industry built on imported animals, imported feed, and heavily engineered cooling infrastructure is, by definition, resource-intensive in a country that has very little water or grazing land to spare. Some of that resource burden is subsidized directly by the state. Under a formal support agreement disclosed in Baladna's own IPO filings, the Qatari government committed to paying the company up to 1.27 billion riyals, roughly $349 million, in compensation spread across a 10-year window, contingent on the company hitting production targets and using its IPO proceeds to pay down debt. Strip that government payment out of the books, and analysts at QNB Financial Services calculated that Baladna's profit margin would roughly fall in half. Analysts studying Qatar's food security push have flagged the same open question again and again. How much of this is a genuinely sustainable industry, and how much is a very expensive insurance policy against another blockade, propped up for as long as the government is willing to keep paying for it? Neither the Holstein cows nor the desert around them changed. What changed was how much money and engineering Qatar was suddenly willing to throw at the gap between the two. Keeping a Holstein cow alive and productive through a Qatari summer comes down to one relentless engineering problem: heat. Baladna's 40 barns run high-volume industrial fans alongside low and high-pressure misting systems and automated soaking cycles, all tied into a centralized control system that constantly adjusts for temperature and humidity. The result, on paper, sounds simple. Hold the air inside each barn around 28 degrees Celsius, even when it's pushing past 43 degrees just outside the walls. In practice, doing that continuously, for tens of thousands of animals, at a scale large enough to supply an entire country's milk, is a non-stop mechanical operation with no room for downtime. Shipments like these follow strict livestock transport standards for a reason. A stressed or overheated animal can die mid-flight or arrive too weakened to produce milk at all. Cargo holds carrying live cattle are typically held at a controlled 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Animals travel in individually partitioned, non-slip pens built to international live animal transport regulations, and an accompanying veterinarian monitors body temperature, hydration, and behavior for the entire flight. None of that engineering stops the moment the plane lands either. Every plane load still had to clear quarantine and adjust to a climate roughly 90 degrees hotter than the one it left, before ever producing a drop of usable milk. Water is the constant pressure point. At roughly 185 gallons of cooling water per cow per day, a herd approaching 25,000 animals adds up to a staggering daily draw in a country almost entirely dependent on desalinated seawater. Baladna's answer has been a patented fresh air handling and dehumidification system that cools and dries barn air more efficiently than conventional evaporative cooling, cutting both energy and water use per animal. By 2023, the operation was recycling roughly 12,000 cubic meters of water a day for barn flushing and other operational needs, with a newer treatment plant designed to eventually push toward full 100% reuse of treated water on site. Even the ground the cows stand on is engineered against the heat. Bedding in the barns is laid over cooled sand rather than bare concrete, one more layer in a system built to fight the climate at every single point of contact between animal and desert. None of this is a one-time fix. It's a permanent operating cost, engineered daily, for as long as the herd exists. The price of keeping a European animal alive somewhere it was never meant to live, at a scale large enough to feed a nation. Dairy cows were never the entire strategy. They were the most visible, most dramatic piece of a much bigger bet Qatar made on food security after 2017. The country's national food security strategy, updated for 2018 through 2023, set targets across nearly every category of food Qatar had historically imported, pushing dairy and fresh broiler chicken self-sufficiency toward 100%, raising egg self-sufficiency to 70%, red meat to 30%, and vegetable self-sufficiency from a 2018 baseline of around 20% up to a 70% target. Vegetables alone show the shape of that broader push. Local production climbed from about 66,000 tons in 2018, a self-sufficiency rate near 24%, to roughly 103,000 tons and a 41% self-sufficiency rate a few years later. Real progress, though still well short of the strategy's original target, and a reminder that the dairy story's speed wasn't matched everywhere else in the food system. Baladna itself didn't stop at solving Qatar's own milk supply. In November 2019, the company listed on the Qatar Stock Exchange, offering more than 988 million shares in an IPO that raised roughly 1.4 billion Qatari riyals. And on its debut trading day that December, Baladna's shares alone accounted for more than 60% of the exchange's entire trading volume. From there, the company started exporting the model itself, a planned $3.5 billion dairy megaproject in Algeria, spanning 117,000 hectares with a planned 270,000 cows and 1.7 billion liters of annual milk capacity, described by its backers as the largest integrated dairy facility in the world. Plus a second project underway in Egypt built around 20,000 cows and 300 million liters of annual production. A crisis response built to solve one country's blockade has turned into an export product in its own right. Dairy wasn't the only front of that response either. Local vegetable producers like Agrico expanded into organic hydroponic growing, a shift that cut water use by roughly 90% per crop compared with conventional field farming, as part of a push toward a network of some 1,400 hydroponic operations aimed at that 70% vegetable target. Hassad Food, an agribusiness arm of the Qatar Investment Authority, had already been buying farmland and food companies abroad, in Sudan, Australia, Kenya, Brazil, Vietnam, and the Philippines, years before the blockade, and that existing footprint became a live supply channel once the crisis hit. In the blockade's first days, regional allies Turkey and Iran flew in emergency shipments of fresh produce, buying Doha time while its own systems scaled up. That same food security machinery got a second, very public test 5 years later. Ahead of hosting the 2022 FIFA World Cup, an event expected to draw over 1 million visiting fans to a country that had nearly run out of milk a few years earlier, Qatar's Ministry of Commerce and Industry stood up a dedicated food security emergencies follow-up center, built on the same national strategy the blockade had forced into existence. The lesson learned in 2017 was that food security, once treated as someone else's problem, had to be engineered permanently for whatever came next. Sheep, goat, and fish farming got their own expansion push too, aimed at the same underlying goal as the cows. Never again let a single closed border decide what an entire country gets to eat. Baladna's own next chapter shows what it costs to run this playbook a second time. In building its Algeria project, the company launched an airlift of 30,000 dairy cows from the United States alone, spread across 109 separate flights carrying roughly 300 animals each, part of a procurement and logistics program estimated at $250 to $300 million, or somewhere around $8,000 to $10,000 a cow once flights, veterinary care, and logistics are counted. That's the real, current price tag on exporting a solution that Qatar itself built out of pure necessity in 2017. Run the timeline start to finish, and the speed of it is still startling. In June 2017, Qatar had no meaningful domestic dairy herd and was watching its supermarket shelves empty in real time. By July 12th of that same year, the first cargo plane of cows had already landed. Within about a month, roughly 4,000 animals were on the ground. Within 2 years, by June 2019, Qatar had reached full self-sufficiency in fresh milk, a complete reversal of the country's dairy dependency, built almost entirely during the same window the blockade was still in effect. American media watching from outside gave the whole affair a nickname that stuck. NPR called it the Great Qatari Bovine Airlift of 2017. Weeks into it, Baladna's own John Doerr put the stakes in blunt commercial terms to reporters. Somewhere between 80% and 90% of the country's fresh milk market had gone dry the moment the embargo hit, and every plane load landing in Doha was a direct answer to that number. The scale kept compounding after that. Baladna's herd grew from that first plane load of 165 cows to more than 25,000 today, supplying somewhere between 85% and 95+% of the country's fresh milk, on a company now valued highly enough that its 2019 stock market debut moved more than 60% of an entire national exchange's daily volume by itself. Baladna itself outgrew the emergency that built it. What started as a fresh milk crisis response now ships cheese, Lebna, Greek yogurt, ice cream, juices, cream, and traditional Leban and Iran drinks under its own name, runs a licensed local partnership with the Bell Group to produce the Laughing Cow spreadable cheese for the Qatari market, and even branched into an unrelated detergent and cleaning products business, more than 260 separate products across all its brands. A company built in a hurry to keep supermarket shelves stocked with milk is now a diversified consumer goods business in its own right. And the same playbook, engineered cooling, imported genetics, massive centralized barns, is now being rebuilt at even larger scale in Algeria and Egypt, exporting a solution born entirely out of necessity to countries that never had a blockade forcing their hand at all. The farm itself has become something more than an industrial site. Baladna Farm and Park, spread across 2.4 million square meters north of Doha, now draws visitors who come specifically to watch an automated milking carousel process cows in real time, alongside a zoo stocked with kangaroos, giant tortoises, peacocks, alpacas, and pygmy goats. For a country that spent decades importing nearly everything it ate, a working dairy farm turning into something close to a domestic tourist pilgrimage site is its own kind of quiet payoff. The Qatari desert never got any less hostile to a Holstein cow. The heat, the water scarcity, the total absence of natural grazing land, none of that changed between 2016 and today. What changed was a decision, made under real pressure, to spend whatever it took in engineering, water, and imported animals to make an impossible climate mismatch work anyway, and to keep making it work, barn by barn, cow by cow, for as long as the strategy demanded. It's not a clean, uncomplicated triumph. The water use is real, the reliance on state support is real, and the long-term sustainability of running a European dairy breed through Gulf summers indefinitely is still an open question nobody has fully answered. But the fact remains that a country with almost no natural conditions for dairy farming now exports its own model of how to build one. Proof that impossible for this climate and impossible were never quite the same claim. The political crisis that started all of this eventually resolved on its own terms. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt signed the Al-Ula Declaration in January 2021, restoring full diplomatic, air, land, and sea ties with Qatar after 3.5 years. But by the time that reconciliation happened, it was almost beside the point for milk. Qatar had already reached full dairy self-sufficiency back in June 2019, a year and a half before the politicians finished resolving the dispute that started the whole project. The country didn't wait for a diplomatic fix. It built its own, permanently, while the blockade was still technically in effect. If stories like this, where a crisis forces a country to build something nature never intended to allow, are what you come here for, subscribe, because next time we're looking at a very different landscape, solving a strikingly similar problem.